Good evening. NATO virtually accused the Serbs today of using refugees as human shields after the worst single loss of civilian life of the Kosovo bombing campaign. The Serbs say 87 died yesterday when NATO jets attacked the Kosovo village of Korisha just before midnight. NATO expressed deep regret but said the village was being used as a military command post and civilians had deliberately been put at risk.
The name of Korisha is now part of the roll call of tragedy in Kosovo. Beyond dispute that many people died here. Fiercely disputed exactly how and why they died. The Serbs say they were refugees killed in a NATO air raid. The alliance hints strongly that the blame lies with the Serbs because these civilians and those who died, it says, may have been used as human shields around a military command post.
If there were civilians in this particular location identified as a military target, they were brought there by someone. And why aren't those people sleeping in their homes where they should be, where we would never harm them, because we would know that's where they were?
This is the actual picture.
Cockpit cameras on the plane that dropped the bombs ran out of film, but NATO says these images from other aircraft show the target was a military base. They show too, though, how hard it would be to know if there was a human shield, a favoured tactic of the Serbs, according to the Pentagon.
We've seen, obviously, people on bridges, camping out on bridges, sleeping on bridges. We've heard reports of refugees being forced to stay under bridges so they could be killed if the bridge were struck.
Despite the tragedy at Korisha, the air raids like this one just inside Kosovo go on. America, though, has now said NATO will be more discriminating in its choice of targets, although it warns that will be difficult. Kevin Connolly, BBC News.
The BBC's Jackie Rowland was among a group of Western journalists taken to Korisha today by the Serb authorities. She's now back in Kosovo's capital, Pristina. I spoke to her a short time ago and asked her what she'd seen.
We saw the wreckage of about 15 tractors that had been burnt out by the explosions just on the outskirts of the village of Korisha. The charred bodies of the people killed in the attack and the pieces of body had been removed by this time and taken to a local mortuary. However, there were a number of items of clothing strewn across the site, food, and in the trailers of the tractors we could see blankets and carpets which clearly the refugees had been sleeping on at the time of the attack.
Were you free to roam around and check out for yourself whether there had been a military presence there?
Our movements were somewhat limited. We were only allowed to spend a short period of time at the site of the attack, maybe 15, 20 minutes. I'd say we were kept on a fairly short leash, but that said, we could roam around the site itself and look also at a few small buildings in the area to try and ascertain what they were. We couldn't see anything at first sight that would appear to be the kind of command centre that NATO has referred to, nor could we see any kind of military equipment. But I should point out it was more than 24 hours after the attack that we went to the scene, clearly ample time if anyone wanted to move that kind of military equipment.
Jackie Rowland, thank you.
So long as we are being told by the Prime Minister that the air campaign will succeed, it is difficult for us to advocate an alternative policy. We are not privy to the military intelligence or the military advice. We have asked the questions. William Hague on Wednesday specifically asked the Prime Minister whether NATO might not soon confront a difficult choice, either to accept a compromise, which the Prime Minister said he doesn't want and which we certainly don't want, or to pursue a different military course which will achieve those objectives. And he didn't get an answer to that question. He also asked, very pertinently, whether the Prime Minister could give an assurance that General Gusry and his fellow officers in NATO have the men, equipment and freedom of action to pursue a strategy that they believe will succeed. And he didn't get an answer to that question either. Now, these questions are at the heart of what NATO should do now.
Mr. Howard, thanks very much indeed. In the early hours of this morning, the United Nations Security Council agreed a statement expressing its deep distress and concern over the bombing by NATO of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. But in China, the public protests have been sustained all week. There have been angry scenes outside the American and British embassies in Beijing, and the American consulate in Chengdu was attacked and partially burnt. The Chinese government has demanded a full and open investigation and the punishment of those responsible. but many believe it's hoping for something more than that. Duncan Hewitt reports from Beijing.
For days, the demonstrators called on NATO to stop bombing Yugoslavia. The Chinese government has been opposed to the campaign from the start. Now, for the first time, others may be beginning to take note of Beijing's views. German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder visited China this week and sought its backing for the G8 peace proposals. China accepted that the plan could be the basis for a future negotiated settlement, he said. Yet China, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, is now setting conditions for its cooperation, saying it will allow no UN debate until the bombing stops. Beijing has been particularly concerned about the implications of NATO's action, given its own anxieties about separatism in Taiwan and Tibet. Now, according to Susan Lawrence of the Far Eastern Economic Review in Beijing, it wants to exert its influence.
China sees terribly dangerous precedents. It's been shouting very loudly ever since the campaign began that it deeply objects to NATO intervention in a sovereign country, but NATO has really paid no attention at all. Suddenly, NATO is rather obliged to pay some attention to China. So China wants to put its particular agenda forward to condemn the use of military force to solve any of these kinds of problems.